Martin Luther King Day will be celebrated in events around the country, but as in past years, local events will touch on the civil rights leaders' importance to Boston. That will be the case Monday in the community breakfast at Elliott Church in Roxbury. We'd like to welcome the event's guest speaker, also the founder of the New Democracy Coalition, Kevin Peterson. Thank you very much for being with us, Kevin.
Thanks for being here.
We've heard parts of this story about Dr. King in Boston before, but you're telling this in a different way. So explain what you have in mind.
Well, I intend to speak to my audience about the state of Boston from the perspective of Martin Luther King if he were alive today. So given the context in terms of housing disparities, racial discrimination, income inequality, what would Dr. King say to Bostonians? And so I've penned an imaginary letter from Dr. King, which states to the citizens of Boston what he would be thinking and what his concerns and admonishments would be.
Now, of course, as much as you might be channeling what's happening now and channeling Kevin Peterson, it's more important to channel Dr. King. So is there a model of his writing that you might have been helped by in this particular case?
Yeah, I modeled it on a sermon, quite frankly, preached by Dr. King in 1956 at his church, Ebenezer Church in Atlanta, which was entitled Paul's Letter to the American Christians, where Dr. King channeled the Apostle Paul 2,000 years after Apostle Paul's death. So in some ways, it's an imaginative, creative way of me utilizing this form of cultural and spiritual critique in a way that Dr. King did over 50 years ago.
Now going back theologically, Paul is the apostle who preached to people outside the cultural base in the Jewish population. So I guess Dr. King was addressing this other base in his message too, right?
That's right. And Paul also preached to cities primarily, big cities where people were experiencing all kinds of difficulties. So in the same way that Paul preached to urban environments, King also preached to the conditions, not only in the South, in the cities of the South, but in cities across the country and across the world.
Well, in addition to studying in Boston and being affiliated with the church in Roxbury, Dr. King did address people in Boston on at least a couple of public occasions outside of church setting. Talk about what was going on, especially when he came back to this city.
Well, there were a number of marches with Dr. Michael Haynes, for example.
From 12th Baptist Church.
From 12th Baptist Church, where he preached, and he was an affiliate of SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Pastor Haynes was. They marched around school desegregation, more importantly. Marched down Columbus Avenue into Boston Common and had discussion and negotiation. Dr. King spoke at the State House in a special session. So beyond the 3 years that King lived in Boston as a student on St. Vital Street on Mass Ave, he married his wife here. Beyond those connections, he came back during his civil rights career to, in some ways, minister to Boston in the civil rights capacity.
And you know, if you look into the local history here, it wasn't just about Dr. King, you know, raising an alert about something that people hadn't been paying attention to. When it comes to education, I think the racial gap in the Boston public schools in the 1960s, the community here was already on that, weren't they?
Yeah, it certainly was. And there was this, as you may recall, this wonderful book by Jonathan Kozol, Death at an Early Age, that had already begun documenting the significant gaps between whites and blacks in terms of public education funding and public education achievement. Sadly, Chris, 50, 60 years later, those gaps have only marginally narrowed.
Because on the other hand, in housing, there were gaps at that time. The Great Migration coming here late at the same time as urban renewal starting to pick up, especially in the South End. Talk about what that meant for black people.
It meant a great deal. Blacks then, minorities then, as they are now, only have access to the cheapest of housing, if they have access at all. that problem of gentrification, segregation, and a very stark, putting it very starkly, apartheid exists in Boston then, and it exists in Boston to a certain degree now. So a great deal, and this is what this letter channels, a great deal of what Boston looked like 60 years ago is reflected in 2018. That's a bad thing. The good thing is, and this is part of the message, is that there are opportunities for collaboration and covenant renewal and community building. This letter urges the community to do those things.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Kevin Peterson from the New Democracy Coalition. Kevin, talk about that. You're studying the message of King, the way he crafted this, and the way he projected it. What does that tell you about the ability, the special ability he had to make these connections with other populations?
Well, he was there's no way else to put it, but he was a spiritual genius. I mean, he had the capacity to engage with people on the spiritual level that brought them to different levels of understanding about their spiritual condition, but also their physical or their environmental conditions. You really do see one like him once or twice in a lifetime. So he's sorely missed. 50 years ago this year, he was assassinated. He's sorely missed, but his message continues to resonate with an extraordinary power. At a level that we can still connect to and build off of in Boston.
And you also have to think of what it was like to grow up with that. Maybe you're still a bit too young for that category in a way, but looking back on the footage later, you look up and you see how well this was done. How does that make you feel about?
Well, it makes me feel. It makes me feel extremely proud of what can be produced in humanity itself. One thing we do not realize about Dr. King a lot is that he came out of a substantive tradition that focused on the Black social gospels, a tradition that was intellectual, a tradition of Benjamin Mays of Howard University, Mordecai Johnson of Morehouse. He was Adam Clayton Powell Sr. of Abyssinian Baptist Church. He came out of a tradition, a community of highly educated, highly focused, highly trained African American preachers. So it's a misnomer to think that he rises out of the head of Zeus sort of automatically. He comes out of a very, very strong and substantive tradition. Along with his spiritual gifts, it just made him something special.
I know we've touched on some of the challenges in Boston, but if you look back also, you see almost simultaneously King and Malcolm X came here, and they also got something from the city. Well, how would you sum that up?
Well, that's difficult to say. There was a black middle class which was relatively freer in the South. There were no Jim Crow laws on the books.
You mean in the North?
I'm sorry. Freer in the North than in the South. There were no Jim Crow laws on the books in the North here in Boston. So there was opportunities for to access information and to do some cross-culturalization in terms of religion and in terms of and accessing the educational institutions here. So Boston provided an incubator, I think, for them to mature spiritually and culturally and intellectually.
Still at this point, you can say that Martin Luther King has played an important role in sort of forging the civic idiom of this country. At the same time, talking about civic idiom, we had a lapse yesterday from President Trump. What do you say about that? His word for the immigrants from certain countries that I'm not going to repeat?
Yeah, well, it's an embarrassment that the President of the United States would denigrate communities, African communities, Haitian communities, in such a way on the eve of the Martin Luther King holiday weekend, one of the most sacredly civic holidays that African Americans or black people sort of celebrate. that he would state those words, state that word, is horrible. There's nothing else, no other way to sort of state it. I'm saddened about the state of politics that he's created through his lack of discipline and, quite frankly, through his inability to exercise racism from his moral structure.
We should finally mention that if people want to go to the breakfast celebration in Roxbury on Monday, what's the time and place?
Yeah, they are welcome. Folks could come to Elliott, the Elliott Church in Roxbury, 120 Walnut Avenue in Roxbury at 9:30.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Kevin Peterson.